Done.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, well, everybody, welcome to the very first episode of Soul's 2022 Year of the Ecological Garden. It's going to be a weekly series. We're going to meet here every Tuesday, whether it's morning or afternoon, depends on which time zone you're joining us from. And we're going to go through a series of themes over the course of the year. And this month, we're going to be focusing on introducing ideas around ecological gardening, organic, regenerative, what these things are and what they sort of mean in a garden setting to gardeners. And the format for the whole series will be short presentations or introductions followed by Q&A format. So please come up with questions, and they don't have to be specific to the presentations. They can be general questions about ecological gardening. We're happy to have all these come. This is the Q&A educational sort of environment, and we really would love to have your participation. You can either raise your hand to let me know that you've got a question, which we will start after Astrid's presentation, or you can put questions in the chat and we'll go through them after the presentation, and I can either read them out, or if you're comfortable unmuting and actually asking Astrid your question directly, that works really well as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a couple of intro things. This series is being hosted by Soul, and a lot of the work we do is in partnership or just through the generous support of Gaia College is actually what makes a lot of our work possible. So I do like to acknowledge that. And if you want to learn more in a formal setting around ecological gardening, organic master gardening, Soul does, or Gaia College does online courses they run by semester, and the January semester, I think, just started yesterday. So today's guest is Astrid Muschalla, and she has been an ecological garden designer for over 20 years, and she also teaches with Gaia College, and she's a board member with Soul and a very, very long-term member, has been helped guiding the direction of Soul for quite a few years now. So Astrid.
Thank you, Sandora. Yes, thank you. And I'm going to multitask and watch the participant list and admit them as they come in. I'm delighted by this series. I think it's an important topic, and we're starting to hear about ecological gardening everywhere mainstream. So I thought this was a great way to start our series, lay the foundation for our weekly discussions, and we can expand from here. I'm framing it in a way to define ecological gardening and where does regenerative gardening fit in, because that's also very important. It's coming up all the time in these discussions. And I must apologize, my first task was to acknowledge the traditional Haudenosaunee land that I live on and am reporting from today in the Kingston area, Wolf Island. I would say ecological gardening is a term arising as an alternative to organic gardening. And I think that's because of the confusion resulting from the overuse of the term organic. And I find many Soul practitioners are calling themselves ecological gardeners or ecological landscape designers, like I have. And I believe that's in large part due to the potential confusion resulting from this overuse. So what do I mean by that? Let's see. We know there's 3 definitions, and it's because of these, as well as differing standards for organic agriculture from province to national to international, that we have confusion as well. It's diluted the term organic, but it is a legislated term. But from the Webster's Dictionary, the chemical definition, as we know, includes anything containing carbon, and that's also including synthetic products derived from oil. And that's not what we really mean, obviously, when we're practicing organic land care. And the biological definition is too narrow. And of or relating to living organisms, well, that doesn't say it all at all. accept the cultural definition which Seoul has used as its basis for organic land care is a holistic approach which emphasizes the importance of relationships between living organisms and their environment. So the Ecological Landscape Alliance in the US also has its definition based on this cultural definition. But I think Seoul went even further because the standard, which outlines principles and practices, also requires the elimination of unsustainable inputs. And then enter regenerative gardening, which initially emphasized drawing down atmospheric carbon with its practices, but also can include all organic practices or not. That's because regenerative standards are not available, meaning that, for example, glyphosate can still be used. And the thinking behind that is that change exists on a spectrum. And if our goal is to improve soil health for a multitude of reasons, then as a first positive step, say improving industrial farming, that could be to reduce tilling, which may require glyphosate for weed control in the short term. So what we're seeing now is a movement to regenerative organic farming and regenerative organic gardening. And that's because I think most practitioners around the world agree that organic is the most widely organized system of regenerative land care in the world, complete with national and international standards in development since 1905. So I know a lot of you know some of this stuff, but I hope that by reframing things a little bit, it clarifies it even more for all of us as we speak to clients and the public about this. I love this graphic here from Trevor Smith. He's with the Ecological Landscape Alliance, where much of our hort practices in general have been degenerative in the past. We have guidance in the Seoul standard to change and use regenerative organic practices, which will ultimately lead to true sustainability. Maybe this will help reduce widespread greenwashing. The word sustainability is often used, I think, very incorrectly. We certainly don't want to sustain things the way they are. We want to regenerate to get to a point of sustainability where there's abundance ever increasing. And there you can see us. We have a long way to go, but I think we have the tools in our toolbox, and I hope this series is going to illuminate a lot of those tools. Regenerative says, whoops, did I go too far? No. Regenerative says in other practices that we protect and feed the soil sustainably by increasing carbon. We increase biodiversity above and below ground, using permanent plants, for example, which also hold onto carbon. And by maintaining living roots in the soil, that keeps carbon in the soil, building it. And through this, we're restoring a dynamic balance. So you can see that regenerative and ecological are organic because these are practices outlined in our standard, noting that organic is really the only regulated system. So it's the foundation that it's all built on, and it's an ecological approach. So whether you call it ecological, organic, or regenerative gardening, all your practices are not about achieving a perfect state, but to create a system that can learn, grow, and adapt to changing conditions and requirements, becoming sustainable, fostering relationships, because ecology defined is the study of interrelationships between biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. So it's observation, watching these relationships, and helping foster these relationships. That's what sets us apart from traditional practices, or let's say practices gone mainstream. I hate to say traditional. Okay, so another definition, regenerative design, this is from Wiki, emphasizes relationships, again, the process-oriented systems theory-based approach to design. Processes that restore, renew or revitalize their own sources of energy and materials, creating sustainable systems that integrate the needs of society with the integrity of nature. And so we're going to find and hear about lots of examples. And to frame it, Sol identified 4 ecological garden design principles in the standards. Let's look at them. Work with natural systems, processes to encourage, enhance biological diversity and native habitats. We see studies showing us more and more that the more diverse a landscape is, the healthier and more resilient it is. And that's important with facing climate change and all its erratic patterns. Resiliency is going to be key. And a way to achieve these is by our plant choices. So a good rule of thumb is to aim for about 70% native plants that are locally adapted and regionally grown for the area. That's going to support resiliency. Number 2, when we optimize and maintain the life-supporting properties of the soil, we're actually drawing down carbon from the atmosphere in this process, carbon sequestration. Number 3, utilize renewable, biodegradable, and recycled materials from local sources and minimize waste. So there's tremendous emphasis in questioning the materials we often use on a regular basis. We have to read labels more and more. And I just go right to the manufacturer sometimes and pick up the phone and just ask a lot of questions because labels can be very confusing. And sharing resources and products that people find is one of the biggest ways we can support each other in that knowledge transfer, because new stuff is happening. We're finding out more studies that tell us about certain products that we may or may not have used. We want to share this kind of information widely. And number 4, consider the wider social and ecological impacts of landscapes and the practices and products used to create and maintain them. So as an example, wider impacts like how we design with plants. And we're seeing that the in-ground relationships increases biodiversity below ground, benefiting the whole ecosystem where the sum is greater than that of little parts. So here we see an example of using layers. Plants don't exist in isolation, and they prefer to grow in communities. And so starting to see these plants in their communities is key, and then planting plants with their relative community. It's a phenomenon that I think we're going to go back to more and more with different examples because it's happening all around us. Here's a very simplified example where you see 3 layers. You've got the lower layer of native sedges, then you've got the middle layer of native hostas, more or less, and then your upper layer of native trees. Very simple. You've got your close to 70% native plant species. We certainly can improve upon this, but it's an example. Essentially, there are no quick formulas though, and this is where we share and learn from each other's experiences. The SOL standard is not prescriptive for a reason. It's not saying, if this, do this, if that, do this. Each site is unique and requires careful observation within the context and observing relationships. And then applying ecological principles will look different at each site. And of course, there are real world constraints that affect each site, including the client constraints. So there's lots of other learning now, much more widely available with online webinars, courses ever being abundant. But hopefully this will be a very unique forum for all of us to share. And finally, aligning ourselves with the regenerative movement, it says in Vandana Shiva's words that I will not be a part of the violence against the earth. I will not support the systems of degradation of the planet's health and my health. and not be a part of pushing species to extinction, including farmers. I will be a part of rebuilding the health of the land, and we can do that together by supporting this growing soul community of land care professionals, by sharing and helping educate others to make the right choices. And that's our hope for this series, the Year of the Ecological Garden. So that's it for my little spiel, and I'm happy to open it up to the floor. Sandora and Sandora, I'm going to put it back to you as host. And if I can do that succinctly.
Helps if I unmute. I actually already took back host because which is good.
Thank
Good
you.
to know for future reference. Your screen share didn't automatically end, so we'll know for next time.
Okay, great.
So yes, so I'm back in the host chair. So let me just pull things up. So if anybody has questions, please go ahead and stick up your hand or type it into the chat. And I'm just going to actually, I'm going to go ahead and end the screen share, and go back to the speaker view.
Yeah, and also people can unmute themselves, and maybe it's not a question, it's something you'd like to share or something you've been doing that's working or that you'd like to try. Yeah, let's hear from others.
Yes. So is there anything in the chat? Yeah, it's not popping up on mine, and I'll totally just start asking my own questions if other people don't, because yeah, I'll do things like that. It's dangerous getting me talking though, because I can just go on and on and on. Astrid laughs, she knows.
I'm watching the clock.
I'm not seeing any hands up, so I'll actually go ahead. I sort of figured start with a question that might be helpful for everybody. What would you actually suggest for people getting started into thinking or gardening ecologically? Are there any hands-on or hands-off skills that you would actually suggest as a good starting point for people, just to sort of begin?
Okay, well, I think a tremendous framework for understanding plant communities, especially native plants, and increasing biodiversity are Douglas Tallamy's books. He's launched an initiative in the US called Homegrown National Park. And if you're not familiar with using a lot of native plants in the landscape, there are some great books he put out. What's the one I'm looking for? Bringing Nature Home was the first one.
Mm-hmm.
And can you remember the last one? Yes, spell his name.
Isn't it Nature's Best Hope?
I'll type that in. Nature's Best Hope. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I would highly recommend that one. I still love Bringing Nature Home because in the back, it actually lists native plants by ecological zones. And I'm in southern eastern Ontario. And so I can use the New England lists very readily. He has got a great website, but he just, as a scientist, he brings the science to a very practical, usable format. And I just find it so resourceful. I'm using his materials constantly. He also has a design book that he co-created with, oh, my memory is failing me. Can you think of his name?
Sorry, who's?
Dark. Living Landscape. His book is called The Living Landscape, and it's a tremendous guide to designing using plant communities. What's it called? Living Landscape.
Living Landscape. All right.
So part of my Christmas holiday cleanup was rearranging my bookshelves. So I had to run the living landscape. So Nature's Best Hope, living landscape, I would say is a tremendous way to start.
Yeah, I just shared one other website, which is actually really I almost never see it shared or posted, which is called birdgardens.ca, and it's actually by Ecozone, and you can pull up and you can actually even put together your own lists of plants that you want to grow based on their recommendations. And it's actually mostly plants that support all of the insects and larvae and that the birds eat. So it is actually sort of fits with that Doug Talamy approach of building ecosystems. And it's Canada, so it's actually Canadian ecozones, and you can pull up lists of what mostly woody species, but they have a lot are native to that area. And I just shared that in the chat. But I see there's questions coming in, so. So yes, there's a thank you about clarifying some of the things around organic, that yes, it has gotten confusing, I agree. The first question is from Jenna, and it's, how can I incorporate regenerative gardening into vegetable gardening? Getting a 70% native plants is more difficult in this context.
Oh yeah, right on. So absolutely true, but then we want to get away from a monoculture approach to vegetable gardening as well. I think that leads to better health. Again, it's about increasing biodiversity above ground and below ground. And by using mixed cover crops in between vegetable plants, fruit plants, that's one way. It can confuse pests by doing that. So you don't want one field or one garden, just cabbage, for example, let's say, but you're going to mix it up. That's where a lot of native plants can come in. Perennial plants would be awesome in that context. So, you know, in the vegetable garden, 70% I agree is going to be hard to meet, but in the wider landscape, that's what we're looking at. So are some of the lawn areas left to go a little bit wild? Can you use native sedges, for example, as a ground cover that doesn't get mowed? So those are ways that we can bring up that number. Also, the type of ornamental plants we choose. There are lots of really lovely ones, but I understand the challenge is home gardeners. They see what their neighbors are doing. They like certain plants. They see them in the nursery. That's what they identify with. And furthermore, the reality is the demand is far greater than the supply. So it's something to aim for. And it goes back to the topic of insects. We are critically losing our insects. And one question that I heard posed, sticks in my brain, is how come we don't see insects being smucked on our windshield driving in the summertime anymore? Where did they go? It used to be a really common thing. 30 years ago, your windshield would be covered, but it just doesn't happen anymore. Without the insects, we are going to have a complete collapse of not only our food supply, but of biodiversity. So that's where I think we have to aim for. So it's a continuum. You have to start somewhere, and thinking, how do plants look in nature? There's not really huge swaths of one type of plant in nature. It's usually mixed with others growing side by side. There might be groupings and it might be repeated, but it's generally not one great big expanse. So that's how I would approach the vegetable garden as well.
I would concur. I would also add that the lowest the lowest ecological harm from the production of food that you can possibly achieve is probably your own garden. So sometimes we worry a lot about the space we need to take up to meet our own needs that's in our site, but that space is actually, there's probably more space and more ecological harm being done if you're buying your food from somewhere else to bring into your space and just grow, and then growing all native plants in your space. So when it's ornamental or just about experience, yeah, actually, personally, I'm leaning more and more towards the 100%. Anything that's not for eating, I'm trying to switch over to native species. But if you need to take up some of that space for food, you're still doing wonderful things for reducing harm. And there's also a lot of there's more edible species that are native to this continent than you might think. So I tend to throw a slightly broader net with that. So there's some room, there's some extra considerations beyond the sort of 70-30 once you bring the food into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to make a point too that I didn't mention the word weeds. So many weeds are edible. And so I allow the weeds to basically grow where they want to grow. I'm certainly not going to, in my vegetable garden where I am cultivating a little bit, I'm not going to let them take over. There's only so many lamb's quarter meals I can eat in a year, but we have to rethink the way we look at weeds as well and educate ourselves more on weeds. The ecological purpose of weeds isn't just soil engineering. It's food.
Yep. And actually, I've also started to learn which weeds are native weeds and which weeds aren't, and I've gotten selective by weeding that way. It's like the three-seeded mercury and the clear weed and the northern willow herb seem to they get left in the garden because I figure there's going to always be something popping up just as soon as it's the native species. So next question in the list is, can you define ecological zones? The Toronto Technical Update on Saturday had a section on the Brooklyn Bridge Park, same ecological zone as Toronto was mentioned in that. I remember that part.
Right, yeah, that's she's a great one to talk about ecological landscaping in practice, and that's a fantastic park example. Is it the same ecological zone as Toronto, Sandora? You were there. I believe it's zone 6.
So there's the climate zones and the ecological zones. And it also depends on how much detail you get down into. So on the broader map that she was referring to, which is sort of North America's ecological zones, and there was probably around 10, it wasn't up for terribly long. Then it put Toronto and New York, which makes sense if you think about like the canopy forest that would have existed in those areas and the general growing conditions. They're actually pretty similar versus, like, say, if you go up a bit further north and then you're on Canada Shield and the types of trees change and the soil changes and everything. So eco zones are actually not so much about the weather as opposed to the primary plant community that is indigenous to that space and adapts to that space. If you go to like the Canadian maps that have eco zones, then you're actually going to find that they will get small, like more and more specific. So there's actually quite a few eco zones within Ontario. Versus that other map that she showed actually was sort of more general. So it's sort of how local do you get, but yeah, ecozones are about primary biology, general geological and soil types, general sort of water availability, and then what species, plant, animal, insect, are generally living together in this space. And then you can start to actually find lists of species for your ecozone. Now, some of those will shift as climate shifts, and some have been, then it's been basically a west to east and a south to north drift, and it's already moved over 100 kilometers for certain aspects of it in the last century.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm in the Kingston area of southeastern Ontario, and our ecozone is the Great Lakes temperate forests, hardwood forest. And we are seeing Carolinian species come further north and further east. And so there's a lot of debate. Do you foster that along and plant more to get ready for that climate shift, or do you stop it? Do you have a thought on that, Sandora?
Well, while I'm doing my native plant series, I'm sticking with the Vascular Plants of Canada database. Lovely resource for anybody who's looking for going, is this native? You can actually check that there. I'm sticking with that list for the ones that I'm putting forward as educating people about all these awesome Ontario native species that you can introduce to your garden, because well, there's a lot more than Echinacea and Rudbeckia, and also Echinacea, and a lot of the Rudbeckia sold aren't actually native to Ontario. But in my own garden, I am walking things north because the climate is shifting at an unprecedented rate. Ottawa has gone from zone 4A to 5B in the last 40 years. So we've moved to zone, it's a zone and a half warmer now. And the official prediction for by the city of Ottawa in their planning document and they worked with Environment Canada to develop it, and scientists to go, how warm is it going to be by 2050? So from a city planning standpoint, and summer is going to be 5 weeks longer and winter is going to be 5 weeks shorter. And we're going to have 40 some heat warning days every summer. And that's on average. And so I looked that up and compared not so much the winter lows, but the summer comparison, because the report didn't say how cold it would still get in the winter, but the summer comparison puts us at southern Virginia. So the plants that cannot survive Virginia summers are not going to survive Ottawa summers in 30 years. And that's birch, that's quite a few of our evergreens. But there are other species that are not capable of growing here now, even if it's season length. And actually, I recently planted pecans and large hickory at my birthplace because the dominant canopy out there is white pine, and white pine is going to become highly stressed over the next 30, 40 years. But nut trees are going to actually be able to have a long enough season to mature nuts there. So the canopy is going to change, and I'm going to try to help guide it towards native species as opposed to non-native species. So North American native species are what I'm bringing in, but I'm bringing ones from further south. Because trees can't walk that fast. The climate's moving faster than the squirrels can take a nut, carry it north, plant it, let it grow up to be a nut tree, get more nuts, carry it further north. They're going to need help. They're going to need a hand. Sufficiently rambling answer for you?
No, that's just perfect, and it actually leads into the question by Anna: should we be looking to choose plants by eco zones rather than climate zones? I think you have to use both.
Yeah. So there's another question there too. Are native plants, for example, Eastern redbud purchased from regular plant nurseries, still considered native or horticultural? You see this all the time with the red osier dogwood.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so this is back to labeling, and what is the source of the material? Is it native if it's coming from Oregon, which so much plant material does in Ontario, for example? And so the whole local movement has to apply to nurseries too. And I can see that it's seen as a business opportunity. Local nurseries are expanding here with a blink of an eye. Some are closing, more are opening. Like I said, the demand is outstripping supply. So we have to start asking more questions. The big wholesalers, some of them are growing the material locally, but Toronto just passed a bylaw for new builds abutting natural zones, natural habitat. only locally sourced native plants and native seed are going to be allowed to be planted in landscaping projects abutting these natural lands. So this is going to cause a lot of really good upheaval in the horticultural nursery trade. And yeah, we just have to keep talking about it and asking questions.
We do, and actually we have to keep asking for the native plants, because last year was awesome to watch as suddenly a lot of the native plant growers sort of went around the retail level and started offering delivered plants directly to customers, to home gardeners. And I thought it was awesome that a company that had sold wholesale for years, if not decades, to industry they went and they developed their public facing under a new name. It was onplants.ca, and they announced they were going to start selling native plants to the public on April, I forget which day in April, and their website crashed because they had so many people go, finally I can order the plants I am looking for. And I'm like, okay, all these years that all the industry has been saying, oh, we can't sell native plants, nobody wants them. As soon as people could get them, they crashed the website and they kept selling out of species. And I was just kind of like going, yeah, it's the industry doesn't know how to retail them. It's not that people don't want them.
Yep. Good point. Yeah.
Somebody else shared, yes, Lorraine Johnson's book, the 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants. I will caution that one's Canada-wide, not necessarily specific to Ontario. Just for all this is a Canada-wide thing, I think a lot of the people in the room, although Nick's from further west, I know, are Ontario. So that book's really good. And actually, I happen to know there's another Lorraine Johnson book coming out soon. So we'll have another great native plant book to recommend soon. Yes, okay, Jan is also, so we've got a couple of Alberta people in the room. That's great that it wasn't just and BC. Awesome. BC, so that 100 native plant books is a Canada-wide one that somebody linked to, and the VASCAN and that birds site that I shared earlier in the chat, those are all Canada-wide sites, so it will be useful for everyone here for looking at the 100 native plants. I'm not seeing any other specific questions. Anybody have them, or shall I toss one out there and keep quizzing poor Astrid?
Well, I think we can wrap it up with one good question.
Minutes. Pardon?
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up with one more question.
Sure. Anybody else got a question, or shall I lob one into the room? I think I jotted one down earlier when I had a thought. You mentioned client constraints, and I'm saying this as somebody who also worked as a designer. How do you help clients make better decisions? Because you talk about what clients ask for.
Yeah.
What are some things you do to help clients make better, understand why they actually want something better?
Well, I don't get into a lot of the background unless I feel they're receptive, and a client relationship usually has many meeting points. So I start with the basics, always implying that a more naturalized landscape is probably more pleasing for whatever reasons. You can name them, and so beneficial for so many reasons. And even people who have no biology background whatsoever, they kind of like the idea of making choices that help the environment for the most part. So you've got to just start talking. I find that I'm wearing my educator's hat almost 100% of the time. Dealing with clients and garden design is secondary. I'm educating 100% of the time. So you have to see yourself as educating, but by doing it in a relationship kind of way, How is the information you're sharing fostering the relationship with you and their landscape? What goals do they have? If, for example, there's a client who is only interested in turning over their landscape to put their house on the market for the next year and looking for a quick fix, they're not the client for me, and I happily let them go. They need to be receptive. You can pretty well say that when I meet somebody or somebody calls me, I say my approach is a very naturalized approach to landscape design, and they either resonate with that or they don't. If they have very specific ideas, I can make suggestions and reason with it. Most people respond to reason, I find. So it's an educational approach, and it's baby steps, and you just have to engage people in conversations. And I always love to have a summary email, phone call, or meeting on the ground after a work session to say, here's what I did, why I did it. And the why frames everything that I do. Why I do what I do is really the reason. So I like to share that, and people
I
might,
know.
they might get it, but at least they feel like they're with the right person if they're not going deeper, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's great. And actually, for those who are planning on coming back next week, we're actually, Astrid and I are going to switch chairs. Okay, we'll still be in each of our own offices, but switch roles. And Astrid will be the host, and I will actually be the guest next week, and we'll continue on in introducing some of the things around ecological gardening. And I have a tendency to sort of pick a topic based on topics that go. And I think from this and seeing what Astrid has covered today, I'm actually going to sort of come at it from a how do we talk about this standpoint? How do we talk about ecological gardening? Because I know that a lot of people who are probably in the room are already fans of the idea and want to be able to enthuse about it to everybody else, so all their neighbors get excited about it and all your friends get excited about it, so that we can all have ecological gardens on both sides of us and not just in our own yard. So I'm going to sort of take that. How do we talk about this approach in a way that helps people get really excited about it, as opposed to, oh, there's one more thing I should be doing. All right.
Right. And with that, I want to say, that somebody from Saskatchewan just chimed in. Thank you so much for joining us all across the country. It's been my pleasure to be here, and hope to see you again.
Yeah, thanks Astrid, and thanks to everybody for joining us. And I'm really glad to see we got some geographic spread in the room, so it's good that this is Canada-wide. All right, thanks everyone, and
thanks,
hopefully I'll see you again next week.
Okay, ciao.
Bye.